welcome back.
Yes, good to see you. How are you?
I'm good. It's been 2 years since we had our last conversation, and I decided to get in contact again because I think we should. Well, it's my mission, and just as it is yours, to keep critical pedagogy alive. That means we should have a chat once in a while, not just you and me, but many teachers in the world about this critical pedagogy, especially in these times. I think it's really important that we keep this on the agenda. So what I would like to do today is to look at the current state of critical pedagogy and to explain to my viewers and my followers why it is important that we talk about this topic and what it can do for education. So, for starters, it was 2 years ago since we last spoke, and the pandemic has been going on for 2 more years. So, if you have to look back on these 2 years, what are its highlights? What do you see as the most prominent events?
Well, I mean, one of the things I see is the erosion of democracy all over the world and the threat of nuclear war, not to mention the threat of ecological disaster, which are being ramped up, as you know, day by day. And I also, in some ways, see the collapse of education as an emancipatory. I don't see the collapse, rather. I see an attack on education as an emancipatory and democratizing force. Public goods are being attacked everywhere. And I think that what the right, whether it be in Hungary or whether it be in Italy or whether it be in
Sweden.
Brazil, Sweden, what they realize is that education is central to politics and that schooling is far from neutral in the way that they talk about it. It's really a struggle over agency, a struggle over power, and a struggle over how we want young people can define the future. And in that sense, it's pretty dangerous to them. They don't talk about critical pedagogy, they talk about critical race theory, because basically they're white supremacists. But in the final analysis, the larger issue for them is critical pedagogy. It is critical education, or critical pedagogy in the direct sense, because they recognize that the first casualty of authoritarianism are the minds that would oppose it. They understand that. And that's not just simply a political issue, it's an educational issue. So I think at one level, we can say that we've never seen such a wave of repressive education as we see now, with the banning of books, the attack on historical consciousness, historical memory, moral witnessing. But most importantly, the attack on education as a democratic public sphere and as a public good. That's a serious issue because it seems to me that education in that sense is really the foundation for democracy. You know, I mean, the first thing that you have to think about when you think about what a democracy means is you have to ask yourself, are people informed enough to be able to understand it, defend it, embrace it, and struggle over it? And if you collapse the educational system and convince them that it's not a public good, but a private good or a private right, or it basically should be aligned with white supremacist, neo-fascist, for instance, ideologies, you have a society that's in crisis. And I think in many cases, we have societies now that are in crisis.
You teach at McMaster University, which is in Canada, which is a whole different country from the United States. So the current situation in America is and in the United States is very different from the Canadian one. When I look at Florida, where all these books are banned, and in other states as well, because they contain aspects of critical race theory and social emotional learning. Does Canada face the same challenges?
I think all these countries, in some fundamental way, have elements of fascism that are developing within them. Canada is not the United States. I mean, it still believes in a social democracy. It still believes in the social contract. Education is for the most part free, and it really believes in civic literacy, and it believes in however watered down it might be, what they call multicultural education. So it's very different from the United States. I think that what you see in the United States is a model of education developing that is basically a fascist model of education. I mean, I don't think there's any way else to put it. I mean, I wrote a piece recently called "The Nazification of American Education."
Mhm.
And if you look at the similarities, I mean, you can do it in a variety of historical contexts. You know, it's not just Hitler's Germany. But if you look at, if you look at Nazi Germany and the educational programs that were being enacted there, they're not unlike what we see in the United States. The banning of books, a logic of disposability. Certain groups were seen as unfit for citizenship, and therefore their histories were erased. Teachers basically had to take loyalty oaths. People who were not considered, white Christian, who were not considered good Nazis, are now equated with teachers who are not considered good Christians, white Christians. And so the similarities are really quite shocking. And I think the real question here is, what's the end point? Where does this go? Right? I mean, when you substitute a notion of critical pedagogy in education that's critical for one that's utterly repressive, how do you then understand that within the context of a whole range of policies? And I think that one of the things you have to understand is that what's under attack here is the very notion of a democratic consciousness. The very notion of a critical citizen, the very notion of young people who basically have the tools, the skills, the insights, the values, the whole power accountable. What we're seeing on a global level in education, and I want to say something about resistance in a minute. We're seeing a massive attempt at not only developing more refined tools of propaganda in the schools and more forms of repression, but we're seeing a giant machinery of depoliticization taking place. This is pedagogical depoliticization. That's basically what it is. These are tools of social and political abandonment, because first and foremost, critical pedagogy is a struggle over agency. It's a struggle over how people define themselves
Mhm.
and their relationship to each other in the world. It's not just about knowledge, and it's not just about the consumption of knowledge, it's about the production of knowledge. And it's about the relationship between knowledge and power. And it's not just a method. It's far more than that. It's a moral and political project, as Paulo Freire and others, Gandhi and others have been saying, for years. And this is all under attack. At the same time, we're seeing forms of resistance against this. In Florida, students are going on strike, teachers are going on strike, and people are trying to figure out how to fight this, because the overwhelming nature of it is that it's no longer on the margins. It's now at the center of power. It's at the center of power, I'm sure, increasingly in Sweden, at the center of power in Italy, at the center of power in Turkey, in Hungary, in Chile. I mean, the attack on critical thinking and on critical pedagogy, better, and the attack on education as a democratic public sphere represents one of the greatest threats to humanity outside of a nuclear war and ecological devastation that we now see. A mindless public is ready to be a fascist public.
It was Ron DeSantis who banned lots and lots of books in Florida because they would contain elements of critical race theory. Could you briefly explain what is meant by critical race theory?
He doesn't know what it is. Critical race theory is a legal theory that developed at Harvard, I believe, in the 1980s by Professor Crenshaw and others, and it's been mostly taught in graduate schools. It's not taught in high schools. It's not taught in public education. So it's really basically just a metaphor for not teaching about slavery, not teaching about race relations, not teaching about racism, not raising fundamental questions about parts of American history that are uncomfortable but yet need to be dealt with. Whether we're talking about the genocide of indigenous people, whether we're talking about the internment of the Japanese, whether we're talking about Jim Crow. This is an attempt to basically whitewash history in ways, and they have a perfect word for it. They call it patriotic education. And I think it's basically just massive propaganda. But I think that what is under attack here is not simply enabling students to deal with the complexity of history in both its strengths and its weaknesses, but it's an attack on historical consciousness itself. It's an attack on historical memory. And as an attack on historical memory, it's an attack on moral witnessing. The ability to draw certain conclusions about what you don't want to see reproduced, being able to understand the legacy of those crimes, basically crimes, slavery, I'm sorry, and how they still infect and in some ways shape the culture. They want to erase all of that. They have a Disney view of the world. I mean, everything's white, everything's merry, everything's happy. and there are no black people to worry about. Women are in their place, they're having babies, and transgender people, well, we should kill all of them. I mean, they basically are really a curse on the planet. It's very interesting to listen to DeSantis talk about history. He made a comment not too long ago when he said it was during the Revolution, the American Revolution, that basically an anti-slavery consciousness developed. That's nonsense. That's just pure nonsense. There was a long history of anti-slavery consciousness that developed by the slaves, and by people writing about this. And not only that, the very momentum for against slavery didn't begin to appear until 1806. This is a guy who lies in order to fashion a notion of history that is nothing but both dominating and rooted in what I call in one book uh, a, 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 a hurricane of manufactured ignorance. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about education now on the side of manufactured ignorance, whitewashing history, eliminating historical memory, disassociating critical pedagogy from social responsibility, and completely emptying out the notion of citizenship as a universal obligation of rights. It's gone. And so this is all very dangerous.
And are the Canadians taught about their own history concerning native Indians and other people who were harmed by, well, the white Canadians? You have a history as well, a background as well in
No, I,
Canada.
no, I think that history has been repressed in Canada as well. But I think that with the recent discoveries, to say the very least, of the number of children who were killed on the reservations and the harm that basically was produced by that, there's been an enormous effort in Canada to resurrect that history and to take it seriously. Of course, there's a right wing in Canada and all the provinces that wants to eliminate that and certainly doesn't want to see it come into the schools. But there is a collective consciousness that overrides and is far more powerful about the reservation schools, about the utterly colonial, like slash capitalist sort of attack on indigenous peoples. Canada is not a country that's unlike the United States, saying these things didn't happen. They're trying to figure out how to deal with this. And of course, when you deal with people who are liberals or conservatives, they never deal with it adequately. Liberals will try to sort of, in some way, engage it without changing the relations of power that produced it. Conservatives not only do not want to change the relations of power, they want to wipe it out of any sort of historical and collective consciousness.
Trump and was had a secretary of state called Betsy DeVos, and well, she was famous for her privatization campaign in education. I don't know a lot about the Biden administration when it comes to education. What about the Biden administration?
Well, I think the Biden administration, unlike look, both Republicans and Democrats traditionally before Trump, right? They never took education seriously as a democratic public force. Whether we were talking about Obama or talking about Clinton, they all see education as something linked to business. Education is basically, you have three models here. In the 1930s and the 1940s, the 1950s, there was some concern in the 60s with John Dewey and others to talk about education as a public good. Then all of a sudden you had this backlash that begins with Sputnik in the United States. And now education is about really, engaging in the Cold War and moving away from liberal education and moving towards science-based education. That becomes instrumentalized education. Then you have another phase where education under the Democrats is all about testing. It's about testing, teaching kids how to take tests, right? And claiming that somehow that's emancipatory. And now under the Republicans, you have, and of course the Republicans have always been against any kind of critical education. But now under the Republicans, you have a massive effort to really redefine both the nature of learning and the purpose of education in general, which is really on the side of the most reactionary, conservative, fundamentally destructive forms of pedagogy. This is an age of utterly repressive pedagogy, and the Democrats have no answer for it. They want to eliminate student loans, which is fine, or at least some of them, but that's not the issue. The issue is, you're going to pump money into schools, or you're going to do something to give teachers more room over the the conditions of their labor. Um, but I also want to say that in the United States, remember, there are different states that deal with education differently. Massachusetts is not Florida. I mean, there's a huge diversity
Yeah.
around education in the United States, and I think certainly the eastern states and in California, there are more progressive views. But remember, we've been defunding education in the United States for so long. Everybody loses, right? I mean, in 1970, it's in maybe 1973, you have all of a sudden they put a cap on property taxes, and it just decimated California's educational system, decimated. But not only that, you also have an educational system in the US that's engaged in massive form of social tracking and social sorting, around race, around class. I mean, look at your Ivy League schools. I mean, look at the various tiers of education you have in the United States. Then you have, now you have a period where education is basically aligned with neoliberalism, certainly higher education. I mean, that's been completely transformed in the last 20 years. And the Democrats have done nothing about that, and the Republicans have reported it. They would like to see everybody basically, be defined through the lens of capital. Good workers, efficient workers, obedient workers. And in the meantime, concentrate power in the hands of a corporate elite that now they don't call themselves presidents anymore. They call themselves CEOs, right?
You taught in high school in the 50s, I believe, or in the 60s, in the 60s,
In the 60s.
in the 60s, yes. And last time we spoke, you told me about a principal or a dean who didn't really understand the way you were teaching. You were teaching, your students were sitting in a circle and you had different ideas. And you said when the principal or dean or whatever was complaining about your way of teaching, you didn't really have a language to express yourself and to explain to the dean what is happening in your classroom. Now you do, but many teachers don't have that language. So what I would like to find out is, how do we create an environment where there is room for critical pedagogy in this rigid system we're dealing with? Because as you know, teachers are subject to so many standardized tests, punitive accountability, teaching methods. We don't have a lot of freedom in classrooms. And yet, what society needs right now, today, is critical pedagogy. So,
well, I think it's the wrong question. I think it's an interesting question, but it doesn't start in the right place. The question is not what can we do immediately. The question is, what kind of vision do we have for schooling? You have to start with a vision. What do you want? I mean, how do you want to define education? That's the first question. And if you want to claim that education is inextricably linked to matters of democracy and should be a democratic public good, then you have to ask yourself, what are the forces that are destroying education as a public good? And how does that manifest itself? And then it tends to manifest itself in more forms, more microaggressions that you've just suggested. Teachers lose their autonomy in the classroom, subjected to standardized tests. They're now being assaulted by right-wing goons, who claim that they can't teach anything that has to do with critical thinking or critical pedagogy and so forth and so on. And I think that what teachers have to do are maybe three things. One, they need a language to understand that education is a site of political struggle. That's what it is. And secondly, they need to understand they can't do it alone, that they have to do it collectively, and that we have enormous examples historically and in the present moment in a variety of countries where educators are rising up in social movements and aligning with other social movements. And thirdly, I think they've got to ask themselves a fundamental question, and that is, what kind of future do they want for children, for young people? I mean, how do they imagine a future, and how does education literally fit into that? And probably finally, where are the resources to get the language that they need to be able to understand that? And there are enormous numbers of stuff online and available that people can read and join with others, and it's happening. I mean, I'm asked to give, to engage with people online all the time who are grappling with particular questions that you've raised. But we don't begin with those particular questions. We begin with the larger vision that people should insert themselves in to understand why they need to do what they do. And it goes from there, because otherwise you reduce education to simply a strategy. And it's not a strategy and simply a method. It's a moral and political project. And the question is, how does a strategy now align with that, given the specific context in which people find themselves? Because the question of context is important. I mean, the other side of this is that, not only are we talking about the need for people to learn how to struggle collectively, we're also dealing with something else, and that is, how do we give them both a language of critique and a language of possibility? How do we say, there are a couple of terms that I'm playing with that are not mine, that are Stuart Hall's, but that are really important. And one is, what is it about the present conjuncture that we live in? Meaning, what is unique to this particular period that we have to recognize? And one of the things that we have to recognize is not only that education is under massive siege by the right, the neo-Nazis, and the right-wing fundamentalists and Christian nationalists, but the other side of this is that education is so fundamental to democracy itself and so fundamental to politics that we have to recognize that school is not the only site of education. It's not the only site. That the culture now, with this integration of the new technology, popular education, political education, and power and everyday life, has fashioned a moment that is overwhelming in terms of the power, the educational force of the larger culture. So we have to move between those two moments, particularly with students who are being educated far more, I think, outside of schools than in school. So how do we relate to students around that, rather than make it appear as if that the only place they can learn is in schools? Secondly, how do you talk about giving teachers more control over their working conditions? Well, you don't talk about them closing the door and going in the classroom and sort of, acting in a way that they can't be seen and privatizing their own methods or approaches. You have to talk about them working collectively, right? To create the conditions where they can come down and put pressure on these administrations and learn to fight back, particularly against school boards that are becoming increasingly reactionary. Thirdly, it seems to me you have to come to grips with an overall logic that defines the rest of society. And that is a neoliberalism that so depoliticizes people. It says all problems are individual, that private troubles can't be translated to systemic considerations, nothing is connected. It creates a massive, what I would call, historical moment of cynicism and despair. Nothing can be done. And I think the second term, when I talked about conjuncture, how you have to recognize the uniqueness, right, is to try to understand this moment of contingency. There's always resistance. Resistance is always going on. And you have to broaden the space for that and to begin to figure out what the strategies would be to make it work. So, I mean, these are all political questions. And I think that, that's what we need to do. We need to, make it clear that the struggle over democracy, the struggle over the future, the struggle over agency, the struggle over identity is really in part about the struggle over education, both in and outside of schools. And maybe one last thing. I don't see how you can do any of this without developing a set of anti-capitalist values. I mean, I think that to talk about capitalism and democracy is an oxymoron. It doesn't exist. Any society that claims that profit is more important than human needs is a dying society. And it's just a matter of time before that society will exhaust itself and all of a sudden turn to fascism in order to legitimate itself. And I think that's what we're now seeing. Neoliberalism has failed on its promises. So now it blames blacks, blames refugees, blames immigrants, blames Muslims, anything to deflect, its own systemic economic failures and the massive amount, and I use this word very, very strongly, the massive amount of inequality it has caused. Because that's the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is inequality. Massive inequality in wealth and power, not just on a national level, but mostly on a global level. I mean, power is global now. Let's be realistic. These corporations, the financial elite, they have no concern with nation states as political entities that basically have control over their own resources. They could care less. That's for sure. We live in a global capitalist war culture. That's what we live in. And that culture, that war is being waged subjectively, pedagogically, and it's being waged economically and militarily. It's a permanent war culture. And I think we need a new language to basically name this.
Yeah, well, actually, Hannah Arendt named that development a long time ago in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. Yeah, she said in the future, totalitarianism won't come in the form of a fancy dictator like Hitler or Stalin. It's going to be these big organizations and corporates who don't have one single face, which is very difficult to combat because nobody is responsible. And these giant corporates, it also reminds me of the term inverted totalitarianism. Sheldon Wolin came up with that, coined that term in 2003. So it's very hard today to pinpoint totalitarianism because we don't have a single dictator anymore.
I don't think it's hard to pinpoint it at all. I think that it's very evident. I mean, you have people all over the world right now who are very upfront about fascism and in naming it. I mean, whether you're talking about Orban in Hungary, who claims that he doesn't believe in democracy, he believes in illiberal democracy, or you have Bolsonaro, and of course in Brazil, who basically claims that he supports the dictators of the past. You know, he wants to be like them, right? And if he gets reelected, could basically be partly responsible for destroying the world because of his destruction of the Amazon. I mean, I think that what we're seeing now, unlike what you're suggesting, is something that we haven't seen since the 30s, and that is a full-fledged embrace of fascist politics, upgraded in different contexts, in different societies, that is unapologetic. It's unapologetic about its hatred of democracy. I mean, look at the United States. You have a modern Republican Party that espouses white supremacy, is waging war on the public good, waging war on the welfare state. And who does it look to? Engages in massive lies, claims the election was rigged, is filled with conspiracy lunatics and theorists. And who do they point to as their model? Orban. Orban. I mean, let's think about that, right? Orban, who suppresses the press, who talks about he doesn't want to have mixed races in Europe, who basically uses the language of racial cleansing and white supremacy to define himself. And that now becomes, so to say that fascism is one big thing that we don't see, I don't buy that. It's very visible. And now that it's so visible, we need to have a language that connects it, that connects the language to the policies, as my wife would say, to everyday life. What are the policies? How do they, in the name of fascism, materialize? How do they get named? You know, when Republicans now in the United States say we're going to ban books because we don't believe that young people should learn about race relations or slavery, we have to name that. I mean, when I write a piece about that, I don't say, you know, this is an attack on Black kids, you know, in Black history. I say it's also an attack on white kids because they're not prepared now or educated to deal with white supremacy. I mean, they have no language to challenge it. And they're on video games and on the internet being seduced into this language that they're not learning in schools. And so it's not just, I mean, the people who are suffering here is unreal and expansive. Now, the other issue is when we say it's not visible enough. I mean, think about how the language of disposability, this pedagogical language of disposability, has all of a sudden mushroomed. It's not just about anti-Semitism. It's about racism. It's about refugees. It's about Muslims. It's about transgender youth. When you look at what is going on in Florida with transgender youth, it's about the suppression of women's reproductive rights. Reproductive rights. I mean, abolishing abortion is mind-blowing to me. Mind-blowing. And the real question here that I have to raise as an educator is, where's the resistance? Where is the massive resistance? You know, as Rania, my wife, reminds me, in Greece, during the Nazi occupation, when you look at the way the Greek resistance responded to that, and we live in a time of occupation. I mean, I don't see any, I mean, granted, the Nazis were more ruthless with the Gestapo and the Secret Service, but you live in an age of massive surveillance. You live in an age where people are signing loyalty oaths, where people are being fired from their jobs. And I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, where is the subjective dimension that people can inhabit to be able to both recognize themselves in a more critical language in which they can understand what's happening to themselves and get out of this privatized capitalist bubble, you know, where they suffer from a kind of narcissistic zombieism, you know, and be able to understand the connections they have with other human beings. What we have seen pedagogically is the collapse of solidarity. The social is under attack. And I don't just mean social spheres where you have social provisions, a social wage, or you have free healthcare or free education. I mean, the very connections between us are being dissolved in what I would call part of this permanent war culture, which is we're at war with each other. There's only one person left on the island, right? I mean, what becomes the model for human relationships is reality TV.
Yeah.
It's a terrible model, you know, and that's part of what I call neoliberal pedagogy. Neoliberalism is not just about economics. I think the left has made, the so-called left has really made a terrible choice in believing that domination is only about hardcore economic institutions. Of course it's about that, but it's also about something else. I remember Bourdieu said something to the effect, he said, we have to recognize that the most important forms of domination are not only economic, but also intellectual and pedagogical, and lie on the side of belief and persuasion. And now we live in a world with these cultural apparatuses, you know, driven by these new technologies in the social media. Think about Elon Musk taking over Twitter, who now is going to allow Trump, I mean, basically a psychotic criminal.
Yeah.
I mean, to basically now come online and turn Twitter once again into a massive megaphone for hate and racism. It's a serious, it's a serious.
Yeah. But he says he's a defender of free speech, but I don't believe when Tesla employers will complain about their working conditions, he will allow it. So he's a defender of free speech as long as it suits him, of course.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. Look, you know, free speech in a capitalist economy is like free dog shit. You know, I mean, you know, anybody can sleep under a bridge and anybody can sleep at the Ritz. Well, I don't think so, right? I mean, people who control the cultural apparatuses, they limit free speech. They limit it with their ideologies and they cover it up with the notion that it's free. Well, it's not free, because if you don't understand the relationship between choice and constraints, you're disillusioned. Choice is based upon the kinds of constraints you operate in. If you're poor, those constraints are massive. Time is not a luxury, it's a deprivation. If you operate under a politics of mere survival, then you have to make a choice between food and drugs. Those choices are limited. You know, when you have these massive inequalities, these constraints are overwhelming based upon particular modes of discrimination, class, gender, sexual orientation. And all of that in the mythology and the pedagogy of neoliberalism gets erased, right? Because if you have a problem, that's character. It's about character. It's about willpower. You don't try hard enough. You don't pick yourself up by your bootstraps. It's pure nonsense. And it's one of the most powerful ideologies we have seen since the divine right of kings. It cripples people. It depoliticizes people. And it sustains a fascist logic in which the struggle for solidarity is overtaken by the the pathological release of hatred and rabid emotions and bigotry. Yeah.
What's the antidote to neoliberalism? What's your what?
Democratic socialism is the antidote.
Does it mean a stronger role for the government? The same government that was responsible for introducing neoliberalism?
No. I don't buy it at all. That operates off the assumption that when you talk about the government, you talk about politics and you talk about power, that the government only has one role, and that's repression. I don't believe that, and I've never believed it. I think the government can absolutely be organized in the service of social responsibility, and it's not a corporate-based government, it's a state-based political government, one that takes power seriously, one that takes questions of the social contract seriously, one that tries to eliminate inequality, one that suppresses those anti-democratic forces that basically produce misery, hatred, and suffering, one that believes, if I can put it gently, both the civic consciousness and social justice. So I think your sense, your implication that government is always on the side of domination is actually quite reactionary, because it feeds into the assumption that there's nothing that can be done when political power has to be exercised on, let's say, an international level, right? I mean, at least that's my opinion. Yeah.
You mentioned new media quite a lot of times. So the role of new media when it comes to critical pedagogy. I think it offers solutions, but it's a threat as well. I know for a fact that many of my students do not know how to discern between fake news and facts. So
Everybody should read Jonathan Crowley's Scorched Earth. It's an absolutely the most brilliant book I've ever read on the social media. And while he takes a very hard line and argues that it does the things that probably you and I would agree on, right? That it disembodies people. It doesn't really lead to radical social movements. It produces demonstrations rather than long-term systemic organizations. But what he says endlessly is that you can't talk about the social media without talking about inequality and capitalism and questions of control. You can't do it. You can't say, because the social media might be helpful with medical records, it might, all the things that we can point to that would be helpful. I mean, my wife and I, we can go online and I'm sure we get sources in a minute. You and I can talk, right, across time and space. But in the long run, overall, this is controlled by very few people. And that's where the danger lies. The danger lies in not so much the technology has its own distinct characteristics that you have to be aware of. The enormous potential for separation and disembodiment, among others. But at the same time, the fundamental question is about power. It's really about power and vision, and whether or not that media can be democratized. Yeah. And used by people for the service of people, rather than used by people like Elon Musk, yeah, right, to basically spread hatred and claim that he loves gay, the ultimate now celebrity anti-Semite,
Yeah, it reminds me of these images from Iran where these women are protesting the regime, and because of social media that these protests are spreading throughout the world. I think that's a really positive effect of social media.
No, I think, it is. Of course it is. I mean, I think that one of the things that any media should help to do, and this new media with its global capacity to instruct, makes power visible, particularly oppressive power, and it informs in ways that might suggest new forms of demonstration, new forms of resistance, and that's fine. But remember, they can close down the media. They close down the internet.
That's true.
That let's not be romantic here about this. I mean, for all the things that we can mention work, it's still still private interest and authoritarian interests that are controlling this media. And I think that to the degree that you move away from that, we begin to engage in a kind of Pollyannish sort of notion that undermines how censorship works when aligned with power. And not only how censorship works, how matters of persuasion and pedagogy work with respect to this media, right? For me, the answer is not just to say, as I just said, that it's about massive control of the media that has to be dealt with. It's also about educating young people not to be simply consumers of the media. We've got to educate people to be producers of the media, right? I mean, they've got to be able to produce their own radio shows, their own television shows. They've got to be able to do what you do. They've got to be able to have 1 foot in and 1 foot out of these massive cultural apparatuses. I mean, if talented people can only end up working for Elon Musk, or can only end up working for Disney, or one of the 5 social media giants that control 95% of the media in the United States, what's the point of that, right? That's glass ceiling reformism. That's all that is. But I mean, we have to talk about where the spaces are to turn those medias into the subject of what we would call acts of the radical imagination. Alternative educational forces that increasingly educate people about how that media might be understood as a site of political struggle and not just a site of convenience for shopping online, for teaching online, for talking to each other online, to do online dating, because that's all privatized nonsense. That's really what that is. Ultimately, that collapses into the language of privatization.
That's true. Because, a couple of months ago, I interviewed Chris Hedges. You know him, you did an interview as well with him. and all his material was removed from YouTube because he
Yeah.
writes articles for RT, Russia Today. So it's
My interview was removed as well.
really. Yeah, and you know, I talked to Glenn Greenwald, and he more and more journalists are taking refuge to platforms such as Substack, like you do as well.
I don't use it, but yeah, people do. Yeah.
Yeah, so do you think in let's say 10 years from now, it's still possible to be critical online?
I think it's increasingly going to be more difficult to be critical as becomes more concentrated in relatively few hands, and any semblance of what it means to live in a democratic country gives way to governments that claim that democracy is an evil and that dissent basically is part of that evil. I think that's the great fight we're having today. I mean, the fight is not between simply democracy and authoritarianism. The fight is between democracy and a radical democratic socialist democracy and a fight against capitalism. It's a fight for socialist democracy against two things. It's a fight against capitalism and it's a fight against fascism. And the fight against capitalism and fascism are part of the same body. They're linked. They're linked. You can't talk about fascism without talking about capitalism. I don't believe that anymore. And I think we need a new language to rephrase the struggle, and we need a new language to see education as central to politics itself. And I think that when we reduce education to question of methods, questions of technique, instrumental questions, we really have lost it because we have no way of understanding education as part of what Adorno once called the totality. The totality. How is it being used as part of a larger totality to reproduce structures of power under the aegis of global capitalism that are destroying the world? I mean, when I talk to my friend Noam Chomsky, Chomsky says, look, think about it. That clock that says, we're 10 minutes away from destroying
Doomsday clock, yeah.
Doomsday clock. I mean, what is it, 1 minute now?
Yeah.
And the question now becomes, if you don't understand the problem, you can't address it. And if you don't understand an issue and you don't recognize how it affects your life in relation to others, you're going to either be cynical, you're going to turn to the right, or basically you're going to just drop out, right? I mean, and talk about living your life outside of all of this, and that's a scary moment. Crisis should create openings for possibilities, and where they don't, that's a failure of education. That's a failure of education, not just repression. And I don't think we've come to grips with that yet. I don't think the importance of education in the 21st century has been adequately recognized. We're not talking about ideology anymore in the most narrow sense of the term. We're talking about the production of identities, subjectivities, how people define themselves, whether they can recognize themselves in larger structures, whether the civic culture is collapsing, and whether there's any room for forms of education that basically are wedded to creating people who can take control of their lives and link that with the questions of social justice and social responsibility.
Well, was education ever meant to raise critical citizens? Do you believe that? Maybe in the ancient Greece society, maybe. But
I don't think it's a question of whether it ever did that. I think it's a question of whether it always contained the possibility for doing it. That's the important question for me. I mean, I think education has always been operated at the edge of possibility. So I'm not going to fall into that trap of saying, well, it's always been domineering, and so therefore power and domination, exist in a mutually sutured way, and there's no possibility. Education is central to what it means to be an agent. The question is, where is it taking place that proves its possibilities? Whether we're talking about Summerhill, free schools, or a whole range of educational movements that took place under Paulo Freire in Brazil. I mean, in Chile, students are, look at students. I mean, students internationally are probably now the most active group in the world fighting for social justice. Look at you mentioned Iran. I mean, the jihad, the fight over the morality police. If that isn't a merging of education and politics, what is? Only that politics is taking place in the street. That education is taking place among young people who recognize that in their solidarity, they can fight the mullahs, that there's a possibility there. They may not win, but that's where education operates on the edge of resistance, critique, and possibility. And that's what we should recognize, rather than simply smothering it in a notion that education is always about domination, right?
Well, their criticism on the system didn't come from education. It came from, well, talking about Iran. It came from elsewhere, somewhere else, and that's
No,
fascinating.
no, their criticism came out of an event in which they had to theoretically and politically put together a series of assumptions about what it meant in
Mhm.
order to form their own sense of individual and collective agency. That's educational. I'm sorry. I mean, that's an educational act. You know, what are you combining here? You're combining theory and practice. You're combining consciousness with the will to both understand the problem and to act on it. In the deepest sense, that's an educational issue.
Yes, but was it taught in schools? Was it taught in Iranian schools? This,
I, I think there are two elements of Iranian schooling, and one could argue this for almost all countries. There's always a hidden curriculum. Part of that hidden curriculum can be very repressive. Things that are done to students that are not talked about, but basically a part of the curriculum, right? Racism. We don't talk about racism, but yet there's massive segregation in schools. Then there are students who basically, as Paul Willis once argued in Learning to Labor, who in those institutions create their own forms of education, talk to each other. They understand that teachers are full of bullshit at times. You know, they understand that schooling has nothing to do with their lives. They understand that they have to read in alternative study groups. I mean, when I went to school, you know, I mean, I didn't learn anything. I learned how to type. Everything I learned in school was how to type, right? But in the study groups after school, in the study groups with people who are on the left, I learned a lot. I mean, I remember coming across the Mass Psychology of Fascism by Wilhelm Reich, or you know, a whole range of theorists, and all of a sudden driving 2 hours to Boston to get a book so we could sit down on a Friday night and talk about this stuff. So it was always in those informal educational groups that are marked by a crisis in established education that I think students begin to put things together that ordinarily they wouldn't have access to.
yeah, you told me that amongst people amongst in the working class were reading Gramsci back in the days.
Well, I think look, you know, go back to Chile. Go back to Chile under Allende, and look at the film, that famous film on Chile, where you know people would assume that workers are stupid, right?
Mhm.
They had study groups reading Marx. They're reading Marx. You know, people talking about Marx. Think about the socialist schools in the United States in the 1920s and 30s. There were my friends, late Stanley Aronowitz, would talk about all these parallel institutions that existed. You know, where people learned outside of the normal institutions that they serve as repressive. And even think about the various Jewish schools that were very left wing in the 19s and 30s, right? Talking about social problems and so forth and so on. And I also think that when you think about the possibility of education existing critically in particular institutions, I think one of the things we see on the right, which we're talking about, is a recognition that if established education can be defined as a democratic public sphere, what it does is so dangerous it can spread, right? It can become part of other social spheres. It can infect the social media. You have alternative schools that might develop. I mean, why? I mean, the thing that I find striking is in the United States, you know, you talked about Betsy DeVos. Betsy DeVos is about privatizing public education. She hates public school teachers. She hates the notion of the public good. She's an educational war criminal. And I think in many ways what they have done is they have fashioned on to a notion of the private, in which choice is always about self-interest, which is the central ideology of neoliberalism, right? Self-interest, you know.
Mhm.
And now they want to fashion institutions around that so that they connect people completely off from any notion of a larger public consciousness, or what I call the public imagination. What's the relationship between education and the public imagination? How do you think that out? What role does education play in a democracy, or should play? What role should intellectuals play, teachers, academics, in a time of rising fascism and tyranny? You know, what are the obligations that we have beyond sort of uh, surviving, if I may put it this way, within these territorial disciplines where we only talk to 5 people, right? And have no sense of the connection between public schools and the larger public. I mean, something has happened in countries like the United States where the public schools have become so, they become not only social sorting machines, but they've been linked to a notion of meritocracy.
Mm.
You know, feed your Vita, make sure you go to law school, make sure you become a doctor, where whatever role they have as a public good now collapses into that neoliberal ideology of self-interest. Excuse me, and that is enormously destructive, to say the least.
Back in the 60s and 70s, you read Gramsci, Howard Zinn, Aronowitz, Chomsky. Those are towering intellectuals who don't really have their equal today. So who inspires us today? You know, voices like Howard Zinn and Chomsky. Do we have younger intellectuals that have the same influence today?
I think it's a very interesting question, and it's a very complex question. And I think that it would be unfair to claim that this generation, your generation, and younger generations can't produce their own intellectuals. They will produce intellectuals in a different social context, dealing with different technologies and dealing with different issues. And some of them will be brilliant, and some of them will get the publicity that they need to be able to, I believe, talk to other people. But I think you have to remember that the Zinns, Chomskys, the Stanley Aronowitzes grew up at a time when the culture supported their work. There was a possibility to be heard. You had the 60s. I think that what I've been grappling with that we don't want to forget is they grew up at a time when the forces of democratization were on the move. There was the war against Vietnam globally, as you know, right? There was an attempt in some way to deal with there was the civil rights movement. There was the anti-racist movements. There was the gay rights movements. The question of resistance, power, and intelligence were in the air. They were in the air.
Yeah, yeah.
And we moved with Reagan and Thatcher into a period of darkness, anti-intellectual darkness. The unions were broken, whether it was the miners in England or it was the flight attendants and the flight crews in the United States. And then the attack took place in the schools. The Powell memo in the United States said democracy's in excess. We have to stop this. We have to create our own intellectuals. I call them anti-public intellectuals. That's what they are. And they're everywhere. They're in the universities. They're massively funded, and they just spread garbage like the Heritage Foundation. They spread ideological garbage everywhere. And so it seems to me the environment is not as conducive. The second thing is we're caught in a period that I have some trouble with intellectually, and that is, I'm older. I'm older. I think in terms of the totality. I come out of a generation. We think in terms of comprehensive politics. We brought things together. We don't believe that these differences should be dealt with in isolated fashion. They overlap. They have to be related because they point to a larger structure that's really the root cause, as Marx would say, of the problem. I think this emphasis on isolated issues, it's cut off from other issues, has so hurt the left globally. Now, at one level, you have to recognize it's expanded the range of oppressions and made them visible, and that's fabulous. But when it becomes sclerotic, when they become ossified, and when biology starts to define politics, you listen to Angela Davis, one of the great voices of the 21st century, who says, no, I'm not simply a Black intellectual, I'm a revolutionary. Meaning that her interest goes far beyond matters of race without denigrating race. And I think this generation has to somehow come to grips with that lack. They have to go back to what it means in some fundamental way to study groups, to working together, to building larger models, intellectual models. And they have to fight the anti-intellectualism of the culture. Remember, who are the heroes for young kids? Kim Kardashian?
Yeah.
Instagram?
Yeah.
Think of where the spaces are that generate, as you would suggest, and I'm talking about narratives of agency. They are really powerful. My generation didn't have to fight. I didn't have the internet. I had books, right? We read differently. Our literacy was more pronounced. Literacy now is fragmented and fractured, and it demands a broader notion of literacy. You have to read the media critically. You have to understand how to be a cultural producer. This is an enormous burden on young people.
Yeah.
The next thing is that, look, you don't want to underestimate the pain that young people are experiencing globally, as you know. I mean, high debt in education, few jobs. They're constantly talked about as being selfish and stupid, uh, endlessly denigrated. The problem with young people is they're a long-term investment. Neoliberalism doesn't believe in long-term investments, it believes in short-term investments, quick profits. That means you have to invest in them. They don't want to do that. So they're dangerous. And so the war against youth now is global in ways like we've never seen before. When you have politicians in the United States saying that a 10-year-old, if she's raped by her father, cannot have an abortion by virtue of the fact that that somehow constitutes a sin against, white Christian fundamentalism, you're in trouble. When all of a sudden food stamp programs are being taken away, when Social Security is collapsing, this is not just a war on adults, it's a war on young people. It's a war on a generation. It's going to take a generation to dig itself out of this. They've been eliminated. They've been written out of the script of democracy, and they've been written out of the script for the future.
I think it depends on what country you're from.
I agree.
Iran is a different story from America. It's a different story from the Netherlands. Abortion is not as big as an issue as it is in America. Here in the Netherlands, we have possibilities without being prosecuted. When I have a lunch break and I walk through the canteen, all my students, they don't talk anymore. The only thing they do is watching their phones. They are laughing, but they're laughing alone. They're sitting in a group of 10 students. They're laughing, but they're not talking. They're watching some kind of meme. And as long as they are fed their daily amount of dopamine, they're fine. They don't care about democracy. As long as they have Snapchat, Instagram, they're fine. That's what they tell me.
I'll tell you something. You've hit on something enormously important that I wish I had raised earlier. And that is endemic to this neoliberal capitalism is an unbelievable degree of loneliness and anxiety and isolation. Social atomization is the poison of neoliberalism.
Yep.
It's one of the poisons. And you lose your sense of connection, you lose your sense of solidarity, you lose your sense of the social. Rania and I have talked repeatedly about, anyway, you walk into a restaurant, everybody's looking at their phones. I mean, yeah. It's like mind blowing, right? And it suggests something fundamentally wrong with the notion of communication, fundamentally wrong with the notion of embodiment, fundamentally wrong with respect for each other. It's fundamentally wrong with the inability to basically communicate in ways that are embodied. You look at, like, I have students come in and have earbuds in their ear. I said, I don't talk to you with the earbuds in your ears. I'm sorry. Yeah. You're going to talk to me. You're going to look at me. Yeah. I'm going to look in your eyes. We're going to look at each other. Yeah. I want to talk to each other. But I'm not going to talk to you like that. I'm not going to do it. Oh, wow, I don't know. Or they bump into me in the corridor because they're not looking. They're looking at their phones. Yeah. And I say, excuse me. And I stop them. I'm nice. I'm not harsh. But I mean, I think, pedagogy at its best is a rupturing force, even at the level of personal exchange, right? Should be a rupturing force, should be provocative in some ways. It should reshape how people are interacting with each other. I have to tell you, I have to leave in 10 minutes because we have guests coming. So I don't want to.
Yeah. Yeah. Many professors I interviewed, they complained about the fact that, back in the days, pre-internet, people were writing down their notes, and nowadays they have rows and rows of laptops they're facing. They don't see the faces of their students anymore. So
I don't blame. I'm careful about that because there's not a lot we're going to do about that technology. It's not going to go away. I'm sorry. So the real question here becomes, how do you fashion an educational system that in some way integrates that technology and humanizes it, so that it becomes an asset rather than a liability, right? So that all of a sudden, you have smaller classes, for instance, right? I mean, when I have a seminar with 15 kids, they're not going to be looking at their laptops playing all the time, but put them in a room of 500, and you're right. They're watching holiday events.
Yeah,
they're somewhere else. I mean, I want to understand the conditions that produce that kind of indifference, emotional, visual, pedagogical. I mean, that to me is the underlying issue that we need to address. It's easy to be, how do you say it? It's easy to be distraught. You know, oh, look at these kids, they really aren't taking me seriously. That's easy. That's just a contempt. That's an expression of anger and contempt. I don't think that goes anywhere.
Yeah.
And in the end, you deal with it by shaming kids. You say, you're stupid. You know, what's wrong with you? Can't you watch me? What we really need to talk to with young people is, how do we make this education vibrant?
Yeah.
So that you don't need a screen to watch when you should be talking to other young people around you and talking to me. You know, how do you inject vibrancy into education and make it joyful? I mean, I would think that that's part of the issue.
You know, now the Dutch government introduced a new law for high schools and primary schools that we have to pay more attention to citizenship. We have to teach students about democracy and democratic values. And the funny thing is, back in the 60s or 50s, when you were in school, these classes weren't available. And yet your generation was very politically involved. So you don't need to have special citizenship classes in order to raise these critical, involved citizens. Somehow it happens.
I think you need to use a different term. And I think the term is, what is the relationship between education and civic culture? And what kind of language and what kind of pedagogy do we want to organize to make it clear that, for instance, the social contract matters, that social responsibility matters, that we reject the neoliberal assumption that economic activity is divorced from social cost, that ethics is not worthwhile. I mean, if I talk about citizenship, I talk about citizenship, but I do it very differently than the way you're suggesting. It doesn't become a way of molding students. It becomes a way of encouraging a sense of agency that makes them critical and socially responsible. That's different. But when I talk about citizenship, I want to talk about three things, and then I want to add a different category. I want to talk about the relationship between political rights and personal rights, which we see a lot, right? But they don't have economic rights. You take away economic rights, those rights are bullshit. They don't mean anything to me. I mean, when you're poor and suffering, do I really care about voting?
No.
Do I really? No, it's nonsense, right? But the other thing is, the other end of this is that when we talk about questions of citizenship, this is not just about nationalism, it's about global citizenship. What's our responsibility as citizens of the world? How do we talk about our responsibility to the planet? How do we have a global ethic that basically suggests we have to have international institutions of exchange, monitoring social justice, making sure the planet can breathe, eliminating fascism? That's what matters to me.
Do you think the Sustainable Development Goals are a good start, or is that just a misleading?
I think there are two elements to think about with respect to that question. I think we should go right back to Andre Gortz and talk about what does it mean to have non-reformist reforms. And I think that what that means is that in the most immediate sense, anything that has something to say about the planet and social justice is in the most immediate sense. Notice what I say in the immediate sense. I'm for it. But I'm not for it if that substitutes an immediate need for a lack of understanding and a desire for long-term structural goals. If it doesn't, if it's not going to talk about getting rid of capitalism, I'm not for it. I understand the immediate sense. We have to feed poor kids, right? I mean, I'm sorry. You don't throw them under the bus because, you know, it's a capitalist society. But at the same time, I don't think charity, to say the least, as a long-term goal solves our problem, just makes it worse. And so we have to balance this understanding.
So let's end this interview on a positive note. What's the most encouraging event you saw this year, which gives you the trust that things might change for the better?
I saw teachers mobilizing all over the world. I see young people in Iran fighting against incredible odds. I see people all of a sudden organizing against police violence. I see a new discourse emerging among people and intellectuals around trying to understand the various crises in which we find ourselves. I see unionizing going on, unlike we've seen before in the United States. And I see the possibility for openings that are truly able to recognize that social movements really have to emerge to fight what is probably the greatest crisis of of human history. I mean, when you talk about the planet dying, you don't come back from that. You know, it's not a meteor killing the dinosaurs and all of a sudden we sprout up again, right? That's not going to happen. I mean, a crisis always offers a sense of possibility, and my faith is in young people. They're the group I look to, not because I'm older, because I think they have the energy, they have the imagination, and they realize that they're a displaced population. They're outside in different categories, of course, some worse than others, but there's something going on collectively that speaks to what I call a global despair that is hard to ignore. And it's in that unwillingness to ignore it, I think that there's a possibility.
Henry, thank you very much for your time. You need to leave, and well, good luck with all your future endeavors, and send my regards to your lovely wife.
Thank you.
Bye bye.